Good afternoon to you all, and welcome to this week's Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball. We are now marking the first sad anniversary of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And naturally, this recording of Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe, will coincide with thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of TV commentaries and newspaper articles, all looking back on how the war started, what's been happening over the first year, and what we're likely to see in 2023. But what we know for certain is that it's not going to be a short war. It's going to be a grinding war of attrition, and it's likely to go on for some time yet. Now, this anniversary week, 99% of all of those newspaper articles and TV commentaries will be devoted to the immediate way ahead. The issue of, is Ukraine getting the tanks that it needs fast enough and in sufficient quantity? Will air assets like F-16s follow soon? Can we train Ukrainian pilots? And if so, if we train the pilots, will we give them the Western fighter aircraft to fly in? What's going to happen with the spring offensives? Will the Western staying power in terms of financing the Ukrainian war effort and giving it the weapons to win, will that continue? Or will 2023 be the year when the Western morale begins to fade, everybody gets war weary, people then start looking for a compromise peace? Certainly, I would imagine that's what Mr. Putin will be hoping for. But to my mind, there is something which is just as important that we need to discuss on the anniversary and as we go forward, which is the issue of how do we prevent all of this happening again? I mean, just a few years back, in the 1990s, we were predicting the end of war in Europe because it was the end of history. Communism had collapsed, the Soviet Union had collapsed, the confrontation between NATO and the Warsaw Pact had come to an end. Der Spiegel, the German news weekly, was saying that no armies were required anymore. We all believed that the forces of globalization and economic interdependence, the increasing role of multilateral organizations, dialogue instead of confrontation, would make war irrational. Who would launch a war which would only damage their long-term economic interests and weaken the prosperity of the international economy on which we all depended? I went in the years after 1990 to innumerable conferences where we discussed the fact that henceforth wars were likely to be within states, such as in the Balkans or in Africa, especially as states emerged into nationhood for the first time and had to sort out their various ethnic or religious or minority problems. But wars would not occur any longer between states who would be far too intelligent to indulge in such an archaic, primitive activity. If there were hostilities, they would be fought out in the grey zone of cyber or disinformation campaigns, or trying to interfere with each other's critical infrastructure, the so-called hybrid war. They wouldn't be big kinetic wars costing trillions of dollars, damaging the economy to the tune of trillions of dollars, and costing hundreds of thousands of lives. How wrong we were. Indeed, if you, like me, have a historical cast of mind, you will know fully well that we've been here many times before in history. For example, before the First World War, which was also a great age of economic growth, of interdependence, of travel, of globalization, many intellectuals also came out with books prophesizing the end of conflict, which, according to one British author, Norman Angell, was the grand illusion. But the fact of the matter is war in Europe has happened again. And we now urgently need to look at what lessons we can draw from the Ukraine conflict in terms of not making sure it won't happen again. That would probably be an ambition too far, but at least making war less attractive, less risky, less profitable for the aggressors, and trying to sort of re-establish the deterrence against aggression that we hoped that we'd managed to achieve after the Cold War ended. Now, many ideas are going to be put forward as to how we can do this. And today, in this recording of Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball, I would just like to contribute my tuppenny worth, as we say, to this debate. There may be better ideas. We need to find them, but we need to start the debate now and not wait to the end of the war in Ukraine. So what could we do? Well, one idea, of course, is to make sure that the Ukrainian peace agreement, when it eventually emerges, is a robust and solid one, which is going to stand the test of time. And here I would say Dayton rather than Minsk. What do I mean by this? Well, I'm referring to the Dayton Peace Agreement in Bosnia in 1995, which brought an end to that tragic conflict. It was far from a perfect agreement. In fact, it rewarded, to some degree, the ethnic cleansing that had gone on. It left many issues unresolved. It saddled Bosnia with a very complicated constitution and too many levels of government. But in security terms, it did keep the peace. It had a military annex with very clear implementation in terms of demobilization and handing over heavy weapons that all sides need to observe. It provided for a 60,000 NATO-strong peacekeeping force that made sure that borders were secure, airspace was controlled by NATO, and that all sides complied with the agreement. Bosnia has been at peace, even if it's not always been a very happy peace, ever since. Compare that to the Minsk agreements that the West has been negotiating with Russia over Ukraine over the past decade. Vague, contradictory. Both sides, Russia and Ukraine, have interpreted those undertakings differently. Both sides have expected the other to act first before it makes any move on its own side. And indeed, the Minsk agreements have not been respected and the fighting has gone on. So the first way to prevent future wars is to make sure we have a solid peace agreement this time round to stand the test of time, and which will give Ukraine the security guarantees that it's looking for. Second thing, set up a tribunal to try Russia for the war of aggression. This hasn't been done since Nuremberg, the trial of the Nazi civilian and military leadership back in 1946. There is an international criminal court, which was established by the Rome Statute of 2002, but it does not have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. Aggressive war, only over war crimes and crimes against humanity committed against civilians and individuals. Now, the EU, at its meeting in Kiev with President Zelensky last week, interestingly decided to set up the first step of a tribunal to try Russia for the crime of aggression, which was an investigative bureau co-located with Eurojust in The Hague, which will start gathering material and evidence. I'm not pretending for 1 minute this is going to be easy. What would a tribunal look like? An ad hoc tribunal, a permanent tribunal like the International Criminal Court, a mixed international and Ukrainian tribunal? A British lawyer, Philip Sands, who is a well-known author on war crimes, with the support of many Western governments, is looking into these various options. And of course, unlike Nuremberg, the Russian leadership would not probably be captive and be able to be transferred to a tribunal. But nonetheless, being able to successfully establish aggressive war as a crime would set an important benchmark for the international community. It would act as a deterrent and deter other wannabe aggressors in the future from crossing the Rubicon into attacking other countries. The third thing we need to do, and coming back to the International Criminal Court, is to make sure that all of the 88,000 instances of war crimes thus far that the Ukrainian authorities have registered are successfully prosecuted. The International Criminal Court has a golden opportunity here to redeem its sort of reputation, which has suffered a little bit in recent times, and to really take this on in terms of establishing the evidence, indicting progressively the individuals who are accountable for these war crimes, and making sure that they face some kind of justice. The way in which the Netherlands has very successfully followed up, even though it took 7 years, the 3 individuals, 2 Russians and 1 Ukrainian, who were behind the shooting down of the Malaysian aircraft MH17, over the Donbass in July 2014, shot down by a Russian bug missile system, is, I think, a good example to follow. Of course, these individuals will not be in court anytime soon, but the fact that the prosecutions go ahead and accountability is established can, once again, not only serve justice, but also the cause of establishing the truth and the facts and be a deterrent. The next thing we need to look at is reparations. The principle that he who causes the damage should pay for the repairs, I think, makes sense. It's not easy. You think of the Allies' unsuccessful effort to make Germany pay reparations at the end of the First World War. But the European Union has been looking at the possibility of confiscating the $300 billion that it has frozen as part of the assets of the Russian central bank. The US, other governments have been looking at confiscating the assets like yachts and expensive properties of Russian oligarchs. And although there may be some legal obstacles here, we should not give up. You know, the Russians in Syria have rather cynically demonstrated that they're perfectly willing to destroy cities like Aleppo, but then they turn to the Western financial institutions like the World Bank to finance the recovery. This is not acceptable. The next thing I think that we could look at would be the establishment of a sort of Western technology transfer control regime, which would make it more difficult for states like Russia and others who are clearly threatening their neighbors or committing aggression to acquire the sophisticated electronic components, the microchips, the very important materials, the production machinery and everything to make missiles or drones, modern aircraft, the hypersonic weapons, the type of things that give these dictators the impression that they have strong enough militaries to commit aggressive war. Again, this is not going to be easy. COCOM was the NATO-led institution in Paris that was used to do this during the Cold War. Today, of course, it would need to be expanded to other countries that would join this effort, particularly democracies in the Asia Pacific. There would be loopholes, it would be a work in progress, but again, a leaky umbrella is better than no umbrella at all. I would also advocate a museum of the war dead to be established in Ukraine, where the history of the Ukrainian soldiers and the Russian soldiers who have been killed in this war would be recorded. This may seem a little bit counterintuitive. Why would Ukraine want to have a museum which would also mark the deaths of Russians? The reason is because Putin has thrown a kind of veil of silence over what has happened to all of these Russian conscripted soldiers, many of whom do not come from comfortable suburbs of St. Petersburg or Moscow, but from rural backgrounds, and which have been used, frankly, as cannon fodder in this particular fight. Their families don't know what's happened to them. They don't know where they're buried. And I think there is a moral duty, particularly in persuading Russians that war is not a glorious exercise and patriotism has its limits, in educating Russians about precisely as what has happened and probably will happen this year to thousands upon thousands of young Russian men. Finally, what we've seen in Ukraine is the violation of so many treaties and conventions and agreements of international law, which we hope would outlaw war or at least humanize it or hold the perpetrators to account. The treaties would number in the thousands these days. Many of you will be familiar with lots of them, you know, treaties to curb nuclear weapons, to ban chemical weapons, to protect women in armed conflict, to the Geneva Conventions on the treatment of prisoners of war, the Hague Conventions, going way back to the end of the 19th century and all of the rest. We hope that as this body of international law progressively grew and was strengthened, that states would play by the rules. But Russia has not done so in Ukraine, militarizing nuclear power stations, torturing prisoners of war, attacking civilian targets, forcibly repatriating children and Ukrainian women to have to go and live in Russia, you know, the use of cluster bombs, which are outlawed. The list goes on and on and on. And it's rather depressing that Russia has been able to ride roughshod over all of these conventions. But that does not mean that they're useless and not worthwhile. We need a serious reflection on how those regimes can be strengthened, where we need to fill in gaps, such as in terms of banning offensive cyber state-level attacks, against civilian targets, or banning the use of anti-satellite weapons. We need to fill in the gaps. But it's in our interest in establishing the rules of the road that we see what we can do to strengthen international law. If there are no rules, there are no violations. And international law helps us, particularly when we go to other countries, to make it clear that we're opposing Russia in Ukraine because it is violating the rules of civilized human behavior, and not simply because we don't like Russia or because this is some kind of geopolitical contest, rather like a plague on both your houses from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. So there are a few ideas. Again, I'm not pretending that they're the best, and you will probably, dear viewers, have your doubts and hesitations about the feasibility of some of them. But as Nathan Cummings, the American writer, once said, nothing will be achieved if all possible objections must first be overcome. Thank you for watching and listening today. Look forward to engaging with you very soon.